Annie Whitaker sat quietly on the worn wooden bench of the steam train, her gloved hands folded in her lap as she hugged her small travel bag close to her chest. The rhythmic clatter of metal wheels on the rails echoed around her, but her mind was elsewhere, filled with hopes, dreams, and the promise of a new life. She gazed out the window at the vast open plains rushing by, blanketed in a thin layer of early winter snow. Her heart beat with a combination of nervousness and excitement. For the first time in years, she dared to imagine a future that wasn't dark or lonely. Annie had grown up in a small town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire. After losing her parents to illness, she'd been forced to take a job at a saloon as a server and occasional dancer just to survive. Though she had never done anything shameful, society had judged her harshly. In those days, merely working at a saloon was enough to stain a woman's reputation forever. When the opportunity arose to become a mail-order bride to a well-off rancher in the West, she saw it as her only escape, a chance to leave behind the whispers and stares, to become a wife, a homemaker, someone respected. She spent months writing letters to Mr. Roland Turner, a rancher from the Dakota Territory. He seemed kind enough through his short, direct letters. He needed a wife to help with his household and promised her a simple yet comfortable life. Annie accepted without hesitation, and after saving enough money for the journey, she finally boarded the train, leaving everything behind. Now, as the wind whistled against the glass, she imagined what he would look like. Would he feel pleased when he saw her? Would he smile and take her hand? She touched the locket around her neck. Inside, a faded picture of her mother that she always carried close. "This is a new beginning," she whispered to herself, her breath foggy against the cold window. As the train slowed and pulled into the small frontier station, Annie's heart pounded. The station was quiet, almost deserted, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered fields and a few wooden buildings. She stepped down from the carriage, her shoes crunching softly in the snow. The air was much colder here, her breath turning white instantly. She scanned the faces around the platform, searching for a man who would recognize her, perhaps someone holding a sign or looking expectant. Minutes passed. Passengers left, families reunited, a few wagons departed. Annie remained standing, alone beside her single trunk. She clutched her coat tighter against the icy wind, still waiting, still hopeful. A station worker approached her politely. "Ma'am, are you waiting for someone?" "Yes," Annie replied, trying to sound confident. "My fiancé, Mr. Roland Turner. He was supposed to meet me here." The worker frowned slightly. "I see. Well, sometimes folks get delayed. You're welcome to wait in the station house. It's getting colder." She nodded and stepped inside. A small wooden building for shelter, but she couldn't stay still. Every 15 minutes or so, she stepped back outside, scanning the road, hoping to see a wagon approaching. But no one came. Time stretched painfully. 1 hour became 2. The sky grew darker, snowflakes beginning to fall more steadily. A knot of worry formed in her chest. Why wasn't he here? Did something happen? Finally, a telegraph boy arrived at the station. He called Annie's name hesitantly and handed her a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The message was brief and cold. "Miss Whitaker, I regret to inform you that I can no longer proceed with our arrangement. I have heard concerning information about your former employment at a saloon, and I must protect my reputation. Do not contact me further. R.T." The words blurred on the page as tears stung her eyes. Annie stood frozen, the paper fluttering in her shaking hand. She felt as if the ground had dropped beneath her. Shame and heartbreak washed over her, all at once. She had traveled countless miles, leaving everything familiar, believing she was wanted. Instead, she was abandoned by someone who had never even met her, judged for a past she could not change, A heavy silence pressed around her as she stepped outside again, but the once soft snowfall had turned into a harsh, blinding storm. The wind cut across the empty platform as if mocking her. Annie realized with horror that she was alone in a strange land with no money, no place to go, and now no future. She clutched her cloak tighter and tried to think, but the cold made it hard to breathe. Her shoes were thin and not meant for heavy snow. As she took a few steps toward the town, the biting wind whipped against her face, and the first flakes began to cling to her hair and lashes. Her journey had begun with hope and courage. But now part one ends in bitter isolation, setting the stage for the storm, both within and around her, that would soon lead her into the arms of an unexpected savior. The cold wind howled through the lonely station as Annie stepped away from the platform with trembling legs. The snowstorm was picking up quickly. In just a few minutes, the gentle flurry had turned into a curtain of thick white flakes that made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. Annie pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to protect her from the biting wind. Her cheeks felt numb, and her fingers, now stiff and red, barely clutched her small suitcase. Inside, she felt empty. The message from Roland Turner rang like a cruel echo in her mind. All those letters, all those promises, and now she had been reduced to nothing more than a rumor from her past. He had cast her aside without even meeting her. There was no carriage coming. There was no home waiting. All she had left were the few coins in her purse, barely enough to buy a meal, let alone a room. But she couldn't stay at the station forever. She thought painfully of returning to the station house to wait until morning, but the telegraph boy had informed her that they would be closing for the night. The station master had already lit the lamps and was locking up, telling her with a sympathetic glance that she'd need to find lodging in town if she could. The nearest town, he mentioned, was nearly 3 miles away down a dirt road already disappearing under snow. Annie swallowed hard. 3 miles didn't seem too far on a normal day, but in a snowstorm, with night falling and no transportation, it could be dangerous. Still, she had no choice. She began walking, her boots sinking into the snow. With every step, the leather grew wetter and colder. The path ahead was barely visible through the swirling snow. Her suitcase felt heavier by the minute, and the wind pushed against her body, forcing her to lean forward just to move. She could feel her eyelashes freezing, and her breaths came out in ragged little clouds. The world around her turned silent. Except for the wind's cruel whistle, Annie tried to stay strong. She told herself she had endured worse. She had survived loneliness, shame, gossip. She would survive this too. But the cold was unlike anything she had known. Pain shot through her toes and fingers, and though she tried to keep moving, her body began to slow. Her feet slipped, and once or twice she stumbled in drifts of snow that nearly reached her knees. She thought of turning back, but the station was already out of sight, swallowed by the storm. Fear crept into her heart as she realized how truly alone she was out there on the prairie. She prayed someone on the road might come by, a wagon, a rider, but the land was empty. Her thin dress and coat were soaked now. The wind tore at her bonnet until it flew off and disappeared into the blizzard. Soon, Annie felt the sensation in her feet disappear completely. She realized with dread that her boots had begun to tear and the snow had seeped through. Her toes were numb. She tried wiggling them but felt no warmth left. As she looked down, she saw the solace beginning to separate. Frostbite. The word echoed faintly in her mind, a distant warning she couldn't ignore. Her suitcase dropped from her hands. It was too heavy now, her fingers too numb to hold it. She pressed forward, arms wrapped tightly around herself, head bowed against the wind. Snowflakes coated her hair, clung to her lashes, and crusted around her eyebrows. Her lips turned pale and cracked. Each breath burned like ice inside her lungs. Step by step, her strength drained. At some point, her foot bumped a rock hidden beneath the snow, and she fell to her knees with a cry. She tried to push herself up, but her legs wouldn't obey. The snow kept falling. It covered her shoulders, her skirt, the suitcase lying behind her like a lost piece of her life. Annie's thoughts drifted to her parents, to the warm kitchen she once knew, the sound of her mother humming lullabies. She thought of how she had believed moving west would change everything. At least I tried, she thought faintly, tears sliding down her cheeks only to freeze upon contact with the wind. Overcome by exhaustion, Annie curled forward, trembling violently. She whispered, a final prayer to God, to fate, to anyone who might listen. Then slowly her eyes closed, heavy and defeated. Her body grew still in the snow as the storm raged around her, erasing all traces of her path. And in that moment, silent, freezing, and alone, she believed she would die forgotten in the storm. Little did she know, someone was drawing nearer. A shadow in the storm. The sound of a horse's hooves in the distance. A Lakota warrior named Chaska was about to enter her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. Night had fully fallen over the vast Dakota plains, turning the snowstorm into a whirling blur of white against dark skies. The wind howled like a living creature, its force shaking the bare trees and sweeping across the land in violent gusts. Somewhere in that frozen expanse, a figure moved steadily across the snow, a lone rider wrapped in a thick buffalo hide cloak, mounted on a sturdy painted horse. His name was Chaska. Chaska was a Lakota warrior returning from a journey to deliver supplies and messages to nearby tribal families. He was taking a shortcut across the open plain, accustomed to harsh winter travel. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings naturally, trained by years of hunting and survival. Suddenly, something unusual caught his attention in the distance. A dark shape, half buried in snow, far from any safe path a settler or traveler should be. He slowed his horse and narrowed his gaze. Was it a fallen animal? A broken sled? As he drew nearer, he felt a flicker of alarm. It was a person. Without hesitation, Chaska dismounted and hurried forward, boots crunching through deep snow. The figure was a woman, curled on her side, unmoving. Snow had already begun to blanket her body, and her lips were blue from the cold. Her dress was thin, her boots torn. For a moment, he feared she might already be gone. Kneeling beside her, he removed a glove and pressed 2 fingers gently against her neck. There, a faint pulse. Her skin was like ice, her breath shallow and slow. She might have only minutes left. Chaska wasted no time. He lifted her carefully into his arms, surprised by how light she was. He carried her to his horse and quickly wrapped her in his heavy buffalo robe, tucking the thick fur around her small body to preserve what little warmth remained. He mounted the horse with her in front of him, holding her securely against his chest, letting the warmth of his own body press through the furs. The wind bit at his face, but Chaska leaned forward and urged his horse toward a nearby shelter he knew well. A small hunting cabin rested at the edge of a pine grove less than a mile away, a place he used in winter to rest and store supplies. The journey felt longer than it was as he kept checking the woman's breathing. She gave no response, her head limp against his chest. He murmured quietly in Lakota, urging her to stay alive, though she could not hear him. Finally, the horse reached the cabin. Chaska climbed down and carried her inside. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a bed covered in animal pelts. He laid her gently on the furs. Her dress was frozen stiff, soaked with melted snow. He hesitated briefly, out of respect, then unwrapped the robe and carefully removed her wet clothing layer by layer, leaving only her modest undergarments. He wrapped her again in thick pelts and furs, then started a fire in the hearth. The flames sparked to life, casting a warm glow and slowly heating the room. Chaska boiled water and brewed a strong herbal tea, the kind his people used to revive those weakened by exposure. He lifted her head slightly and pressed a warm damp cloth to her lips, encouraging tiny sips of the tea little by little. At first she did not react, but eventually her lips moved and a faint swallow followed. It was a sign of life, fragile but real. He sat beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Snowflakes still clung to her hair. She looked delicate, almost like a porcelain doll, her cheeks pale and eyelashes dusted with frost. He wondered who she was, what had brought her here alone in such a deadly storm. It puzzled him. Settlers rarely traveled without wagons or companions, especially not women. Yet here she was, clearly abandoned, fighting for her life in the snow. Hours passed. The fire roared warmly, the cabin filled with heat and flickering shadows. Chaska stayed awake, occasionally giving her small spoonfuls of warm broth or tea. He changed the cloth on her forehead, now warm instead of icy. She began to shiver violently, a sign her body was finally reacting, trying to warm itself. That was good. Shivering meant life. Near midnight she stirred and gave a faint, raspy groan. Her eyes fluttered open slightly, unfocused and confused. She saw a shadowy figure above her, dark hair, deep amber eyes, strong features, and a fur cloak draped around her shoulders. Panic flickered in her gaze, but she was too weak to move. You are safe, Chaska said softly, speaking calmly in English so she'd understand. His voice was deep but gentle. You were in the snow. I brought you here. You are not alone. Her lips quivered, but no words came. A single tear rolled down her cheek, perhaps relief, perhaps fear. Then her eyes closed again, exhaustion overtaking her once more. Chaska watched her breathing even out, relieved that she had regained consciousness. Even briefly Dodd as he sat beside her in silence, keeping watch through the night, he did not yet know how intertwined their fates would become. But he sensed that saving this woman was no mere accident. Somehow, the storm had brought them together, and perhaps the winter winds carried more than just snow and sorrow, but also the beginning of something neither of them expected. Slowly, warmth began to creep back into Annie's frozen limbs. An unfamiliar, comforting heat that melted the numbness swirling inside her. She was no longer lying in the snow. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious or even where she was, but she sensed a flickering light behind her closed eyelids and heard the crackle of a fire nearby. The last thing she remembered was collapsing onto the ground, thinking she might die there alone. And now, warmth? Annie's eyelashes fluttered against her cheeks like feathers as her eyes cracked open just a fraction. The ceiling above her was wooden, made of logs, and not the endless gray-white sky of the storm. For a moment she was confused. Was she dreaming? Was she dead? A shiver ran through her, but not the kind from cold, more like fear mixed with confusion. She tried to move her hand and felt thick furs covering her. Someone had removed her wet clothes and wrapped her in warm pelts. Her heart started to race. Who had done this? Where was she? She tried to sit up, but her body was still, weak and sore. As she turned her head, she saw him, a tall man sitting near the fire, tending to it, his back partly to her. His long dark hair hung loosely around his shoulders, and the firelight reflected softly off his profile. He looked strong, calm, and quiet. His clothing wasn't like the settlers she had seen. It was traditional buckskin and fur, clearly handmade and beautifully stitched. Realization settled in. He was a native man, a Lakota, judging by the patterns on his clothing. Fear jolted through her, though she was too weak to even sit up. She'd never met an Indian man before, and all she had heard from townsfolk back east were frightening stories told to scare children or justify resentment. But this man, he had saved her life. He had carried her from the snowstorm. He had built this fire and kept watch. She tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped her dry lips. Still, Chaska heard it. He turned toward her with a calm, steady gaze. He saw her eyes open, her body trembling with both cold and fear. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and knelt beside her. She flinched slightly, pressing into the furs as though they could shield her. "Do not be afraid," he said softly, his English clear but lightly accented. His voice was deep, gentle, calming. "You were dying in the snow. I brought you here. So you can live." Annie stared at him, her lips trembling. She tried to thank him, but still no sound came. He reached for a wooden cup on the table, filled with warm broth, and held it near her lips. "Drink," he said quietly. "It will help." Hesitating, she parted her lips and accepted a few sips. The warmth spread through her throat and into her chest. Tears pricked her eyes again, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. She realized he had been caring for her for hours. She lowered her gaze. Thank you," she managed, her voice raspy and faint. Chaska nodded once and returned to the fire. He wanted to give her space to breathe and understand. He did not ask her questions yet. He merely tended to her trembling body, checking her frostbitten feet and hands, wrapping them in warm cloths. His movements were careful and respectful. Annie was still in shock, but his calmness made it easier to trust him. Even if just a little dot as the hours passed, Annie drifted in and out of sleep, but each time she opened her eyes, he was still there. Sometimes sitting by the window, sometimes placing more wood into the fire, sometimes gently offering her another sip of tea. He didn't try to touch her more than necessary. He didn't force her to talk. He simply remained nearby, like a quiet guardian in the flickering glow of the flames. Later, as the night deepened, the storm outside raged louder. Wind howled against the cabin walls. Annie could see glimpses of it through the small window. Sheets of snow flying sideways. If not for him, she would be lying under that snow right now, buried and gone. That thought brought a wave of emotion so strong she had to look away to keep herself from crying again. This stranger, this Lakota warrior, had shown her more compassion in a day than the man who had promised to marry her ever had. She closed her eyes again, exhausted, and a small feeling of safety wrapped around her for the first time in years. Her body was still sore, and her future still uncertain. But in that cabin, next to that fire, with him watching over her, Annie felt something fragile beginning to return, hope. "Would you like me to continue with?" Morning light filtered through the cracks in the wooden cabin walls, soft and golden. The storm had calmed, leaving a peaceful silence outside, but inside the small room, the warmth from the fire still glowed. Annie opened her eyes slowly, feeling something she hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime, comfort. Real, steady warmth, wrapping around her like a protective embrace. For a moment she almost forgot where she was. Then she heard the gentle sound of someone stirring near the fire, and she remembered the Lakota man who saved her. Chaska was kneeling by the hearth, mixing herbs into a small clay bowl. His presence was calm, thoughtful. He didn't speak right. Away, giving her time to awaken. Annie sat up slightly, feeling the thick furs slide off her shoulders. Her body still ached, especially her feet, which throbbed with numb, stinging pain. She winced and looked down. Her boots had been removed, and her feet were wrapped in warm cloths, the skin pink and tender. He had clearly taken great care not to let the frostbite worsen. He turned to her and gave a small nod of greeting. "You are awake," he said softly. "Good." Annie nodded nervously, clutching the fur around her shoulders like a shield. Chaska approached her with the bowl. "For your feet," he said, dipping a cloth into the mixture. "This will heal and stop the pain." She hesitated, unsure, but he gently lifted her foot and began applying the herbal ointment with utmost care. His hands were steady and respectful. Annie expected to feel awkward or embarrassed, but instead she felt safe. He wasn't doing this to take advantage of her. He was treating her like a human being, an equal. His voice was low and calming. "You should rest more, but you need to eat." With that, he brought her a wooden bowl filled with porridge and pieces of dried berries. The smell was simple but comforting. Her stomach growled at the scent. She hadn't eaten since she left the train, and the hunger suddenly hit her. She thanked him quietly and ate slowly. Feeling strength return to her dot as the morning passed, Chaska gave her a folded bundle of warm clothes, a soft doeskin dress, and a pair of fur-lined leggings clearly crafted by hand. They were far warmer than her travel-worn dress. "You wear these," he said gently. "Your clothes are still wet." Annie didn't argue. She changed behind a screen while he respectfully turned away. The clothes fit surprisingly well, and they were incredibly warm. When she stepped out, Chaska glanced over and gave the slightest smile. "They suit you," he said. His compliment was simple, sincere, not the eager flattery of men she'd met before. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable. Annie watched him prepare dried meat over the fire and carve wooden utensils. He moved with grace and purpose, like a man used to surviving in the wilderness. She began to realize how much he must know about living with nature, healing, caring for others. And though they came from completely different worlds, she felt no judgment from him, only quiet strength. At one point, Annie's voice trembled as she finally gathered the courage to speak more than a few words. "You saved my life," she said softly. "Why?" Chaska looked at her with calm, thoughtful eyes. "Because you are a person. A life is sacred. I saw you in the snow and could not leave you there." The simplicity of his answer stunned her. No man in her past had spoken like that. She felt a lump in her throat and blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "I thought no one would care." He tilted his head slightly. "Someone cared." He said it simply, as if it was a fact of life. As the day passed, he repaired her torn shoes and began making a new pair of soft moccasins for her feet. Annie watched, amazed by the skill of his hands. He taught her how to sip a tonic of pine needle tea to regain strength, explaining how its warmth would heal her lungs after breathing snow for so long. Every action he took was gentle, deliberate. He gave her space, never crowding her or forcing conversation. And slowly, Annie felt her fear fade. That evening, as she sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket he had given her, she looked at him again and realized, for the first time since she arrived in this harsh land, she no longer felt abandoned. In Chaska's quiet care, her heart began to thaw, just like her frostbitten feet. She still didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was now certain: she was no longer alone. Over the next 2 days, Annie slowly regained strength as Chaska continued to care for her with steady dedication. The storm outside had paused, leaving behind a landscape coated in glistening snow, but a new warmth had settled inside the cabin. It was a quiet partnership, built not on many words, but on simple acts of kindness. Each morning, Chaska prepared warm broth and tea for her, encouraging her to eat even when she felt too tired. Annie soon realized how much effort he was putting into every little thing: boiling water, tending the fire through the night, checking her bandaged feet, even stepping out briefly to gather herbs and dried roots from a small stash he had stored nearby. He rarely left her alone for long, and when he did, he made sure she was warm and comfortable before stepping out. Annie began to feel less like a burden. Though her feet still hurt and walking was difficult, she started sitting up on her own, brushing her hair, and speaking more. The first real conversation they had began quietly over breakfast. Chaska handed her a small wooden bowl of stew and sat across from her at the table. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt peaceful, but Annie finally spoke. "My name is Annie Whitaker," she said softly. Chaska nodded gently. "I am Chaska," he replied. She repeated his name in a whisper, trying to pronounce it correctly. He smiled a little and helped her with the pronunciation. They shared a small laugh when she got it right, and for the first time since arriving, she truly smiled. They began to exchange small details about their lives. Annie told him how she had come to the West hoping for a new beginning as a mail order bride. She hesitated, embarrassed to admit she had been abandoned even before the marriage could happen. But Chaska did not judge her. He listened with quiet empathy. When she spoke of the saloon job she had once worked and how people had looked down on her, she lowered her gaze with shame. Chaska gently said, "A person's work does not make them less human. Survival is not." Shame. Those words struck her deeply. Tears welled in her eyes. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Chaska, in turn, shared a bit of his own story, that he had lost family to illness, and that he often found himself traveling between camps, sometimes alone, sometimes helping others. He spoke modestly, but Annie could hear the pain buried beneath his calm tone. She realized he too had experienced loss and isolation, though in a different way from her own. Between them formed a tender kind of understanding. Both had felt abandoned by the world in different ways, and somehow, in this small cabin, they had found a moment of refuge together. By the second afternoon, Annie insisted on helping. She asked if she could slice vegetables or stir the pot. Chaska hesitated, but eventually allowed her to help a little. She sat on a stool near the fire, carefully chopping herbs as he handed them to her. The small task made her feel useful again, not helpless, but human. During the evening, Chaska carefully unwrapped her bandages and examined her feet. They were healing, the swelling going down. "You will walk again soon," he said with quiet certainty. Annie looked at him with gratitude. "You saved more than my life," she admitted softly. "You saved my spirit." Chaska's eyes softened. "You saved yourself too," he replied. "You did not give up." Each night, as the fire crackled, they shared stories, sometimes personal, sometimes simple observations about the snow or stars they saw through the window. Annie found herself laughing softly at some of his stories about his horse, or about how he once tried to cook something terrible and nearly set a camp on fire. Those small flames of humor broke through the heavy sadness she carried. And though there was still a respectful distance between them, Annie noticed the way Chaska looked at her, not with pity, but with genuine concern and gentle admiration. She felt her heart stir with something she hadn't felt in a long time, the beginning of trust. Even after just a few days in his care, Annie realized that Chaska had become more than just her rescuer. He had become a friend, perhaps the first true friend she had ever had as an adult. Someone who knew her pain without judging her and who showed kindness with every action. As the snow outside began to settle and the storm clouds drifted away, Annie wondered if this unexpected shelter, this quiet hidden cabin, might be the start of a different kind of journey than the one she had imagined. Not the end of her life, but the beginning of something new, born out of kindness, courage, and a warm fire in the heart of winter. The days in the cabin passed gently, each one marking a small step toward healing, not just for Annie's frostbitten feet, but for the wounds neither she nor Chaska could see. As the sun melted a bit of snow outside, a different warmth was growing within the small wooden shelter. It was no longer just safety. It had become companionship. One evening, the fire burned low and soft, sending a golden glow across the room. Annie sat beside it, wrapped in a softer, lighter blanket, her feet now healed enough that she could carefully stand and walk a few steps. Chaska was seated nearby, carving a small piece of bone into something delicate, a pendant or charm perhaps. The silence between them was peaceful and easy. Annie watched the flames dance, and her thoughts wandered. A sudden, unexpected urge came over her, the need to speak, to let out everything that had been locked in her heart. She looked up at Chaska and spoke softly. "May I tell you something?" "Something difficult?" He glanced up, nodding with calm understanding. "You may tell me anything. I will listen." Annie took a trembling breath. Her voice was quiet but clear as she began to open up about her life before she came west. She told him about losing her parents when she was young, about how she took work at a saloon because no one would hire a poor, uneducated girl for anything else. She described the shameful stares of townsfolk, how gossip ruined her reputation, how the man she trusted to marry her rejected her the moment he learned about her past. Her words came slowly at first, then poured out in a flood of tears and confession. "I wasn't a bad woman," she said, her voice cracking, "but they all treated me like I was worthless." Chaska listened in absolute stillness, giving her his full attention. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at her with shock or pity. When she finally finished, she felt strangely empty but lighter, as if someone had lifted a burden from her shoulders simply by hearing her pain. Chaska spoke quietly. "Your past does not make you unworthy. Survival is not shame. What you did to live, that is called strength." Annie looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. Those simple words of acceptance struck deeper than anything she had ever heard. In that moment, something inside her heart began to mend. Then, softly, Chaska began speaking about his own past. He told her about the loss of his younger brother, who died during a harsh winter much like this one. He spoke of the conflicts his people faced with settlers, the broken treaties, the sorrow of being judged without being understood. He told her how he often chose to live between both worlds, not fully belonging to one or the other, because he'd seen both cruelty and goodness on either side. He spoke with honesty and a quiet sorrow, not bitterness. Annie realized he too had been misunderstood and wounded in ways that were unseen. As he shared all this, Annie's eyes softened, and she listened with as much care as he had given her. Their stories, though different in culture and history, were rooted in the same experience: rejection, loneliness, and a longing to be seen as human. Chaska finished carving the small bone charm he had been working on. It was shaped like a feather, a symbol of honor and protection among his people. He held it out to her. "For you," he said, "a feather, to remind you that even after a storm, the bird flies again." Annie took it gently in her hand and felt her heart swell. She didn't have words, only gratitude. She clasped the charm to her chest. That night, as the fire crackled, they sat a bit closer than before, the silence now filled with understanding instead of distance. Annie realized she no longer felt like a stranger. In his presence, she felt seen and accepted for the first time in her adult life. They talked until the fire turned to embers, sharing small bits of laughter, gentle memories, and moments of thoughtful quiet. Two souls who carried invisible scars were beginning to heal each other simply through compassion. By the time Annie drifted to sleep, she felt more at peace than she had ever felt, even before the storm. She wasn't falling in love yet, not fully, but something elemental had begun to bloom between them: trust, respect, and maybe the earliest spark of a bond that could one day become something deeper. After several days of rest and recovery, Annie was finally strong enough to step outside the cabin for the first time. Chaska helped her as she wrapped herself in a warm, buffalo hide coat and slipped her feet carefully into the soft moccasins he had made for her. They fit perfectly. Much better than the worn-out boots she had arrived in. The snow outside was still thick, but the sky was a brilliant blue. Crisp and clear. Chaska guided her outside, supporting her gently under the arm. Annie's breath caught as she looked around. The forest around the cabin sparkled in the winter. Sunlight and the open prairie beyond looked peaceful, calm, and endless. Not the terrifying white void that had nearly taken her life. For the first time since arriving in this harsh new land, she felt something like beauty instead of fear. They walked slowly, just a few steps away from the cabin. Annie leaned on Chaska slightly for balance, but she was able to stand on her own. As they stood under the open sky, she looked up at him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Chaska nodded, gazing across the snow-covered land. "Yes, the earth is quiet after a storm. It teaches us that even after death or hardship, there can be peace again." Annie turned to him with gratitude. "You've given me more kindness than I ever had in my whole life. I don't know how to thank you." Chaska shook his head gently. "You do not owe me anything. You deserve to live. And you deserve kindness." She looked at him, emotion filling her eyes. "Still, I want to repay you somehow. I want you to know that I won't forget what you've done." Chaska hesitated for a moment, then reached into his coat and brought out a small pouch made of soft leather. From it, he took something wrapped in thin hide. Carefully, he unfolded it and revealed a pair of delicately crafted beaded moccasins meant just for her, smaller, decorated with tiny colored beads and patterns resembling the winter sky and rising sun. Annie gasped softly. "Are those for me?" He nodded. "I made these while you were sleeping. When your feet are completely healed, you will wear them. They are for walking toward a new life." Tears sprang to her eyes again, but this time not from sorrow. She touched the moccasins with awe. "They're beautiful. I've never owned anything so special." Chaska met her gaze. His voice was calm but strong. "I promise you this, Annie. You will never be left alone in the snow again. Not while I live." His words struck her like a vow, powerful, unspoken, profound. Annie felt her heart swell with something she had not allowed herself to feel for so long, the beginning of genuine trust, perhaps even something more. She felt herself drawn to the warmth in his eyes, a warmth she had never seen in any other. "Man," she stepped closer, her hand still holding the moccasins. I don't know what will happen tomorrow," she said softly, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "But being here, with you, I feel safe. And for the first time in my life, I believe I might deserve happiness." Chaska looked at her with deep understanding. "You already deserve it," he said, "whether with me or wherever you choose to go after you heal. But if you choose to stay, I will be honored." Annie's breath caught again. He was not demanding anything, not forcing her to stay. He was offering her a choice, a life where she could be respected and cared for, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection and honor. Overwhelmed by emotion, Annie took his hand, a small gesture but one filled with meaning. He gently squeezed her fingers. In that moment, a promise passed silently between them. Not yet marriage, not yet love in the fullest sense, but a sacred promise of protection, companionship, and a bond that could grow into something unbreakable. As the sun dipped behind the pine trees, casting long golden shadows on the snow, they stood together in the quiet winter air, hand in hand. Annie looked up at the sky, for once not with fear or despair, but with a heart full of hope. She knew the road ahead might still be uncertain, but under that vast winter sky, she felt the first true spark of a future she wanted to walk toward, not alone, but beside him. And in Chaska's eyes, she saw the same hope reflected back at her, like dawn breaking through after the longest night. As the days passed after the storm, life in the cabin began to feel gentler and more settled. Though the world outside was still cold, a sense of warmth and purpose filled each moment within those wooden walls. Annie could walk more easily now, her feet fully healed thanks to Chaska's attentive care and natural remedies. She began helping with daily tasks, grinding herbs, gathering wood in small bundles, and stirring the fire while he went out hunting for fresh meat. They fell into a quiet routine, not out of obligation, but out of comfort. For the first time in years, Annie wasn't simply surviving, she was living and even smiling. Chaska taught her simple phrases in Lakota, laughing softly when she pronounced something wrong. She shared small songs her mother used to hum, surprising him with a soft, clear voice. There was laughter now, and sometimes comfortable silence filled with unspoken understanding. One morning, Chaska brought in a fresh rabbit he had caught. Annie insisted on helping him prepare it. As they worked side by side, their shoulders brushed, and instead of pulling away in shyness, Annie felt warmth flood through her. She realized she trusted him fully now. He had never once looked at her with judgment. Every moment they spent together showed her that compassion and respect could exist between a man and a woman, even if they came from different worlds. Later that night, after dinner, they sat near the fire once more. Chaska looked at her quietly. "Your strength is returning," he said. "Soon, the snow will clear enough to travel. I can take you to the nearest town, if you wish, to find work or begin a new life." Annie's heart tightened. She looked into his eyes, kind, honest, warm. He was offering her a choice again. Freedom, not possession. She hesitated, then spoke with a soft but firm voice. "I don't want to go to town," she said. "Not yet." She took a deep breath. "If you will let me stay, I would like to remain with you." Chaska's eyes softened. "You are welcome here, for as long as you wish." Annie felt relief and a blossoming joy deep inside. In that moment, she realized she didn't just want his protection, she wanted his company, his presence. Already, she couldn't imagine a day without hearing his voice or seeing his gentle smile. In the following days, Chaska taught her more about the land. He showed her how to track animals, how to recognize healing plants beneath the snow, how to mend clothing with sinew thread. Annie found herself learning eagerly, feeling proud when she remembered each skill. It made her feel capable and valued. One morning, as they stepped outside to gather water, Chaska reached into a small pouch at his side. He handed Annie a simple carved necklace made of bone and beads, different from the feather charm. This time, it was shaped like a small circle representing the sun. "This is a symbol of life and new beginnings," he told her. "I carved this for you because you brought light back into this cabin." Annie's eyes shimmered with emotion. She slipped the necklace over her head and pressed a hand over her heart. "No one has ever given me anything like this before," she whispered. "You've given me more than I can ever repay." Chaska shook his head gently. "You owe me nothing. Just stay as you are, and that is enough." That evening, as they finished a quiet meal, Annie stood up and surprised Chaska by placing a soft kiss on his cheek. Her heart pounded, but she didn't look away. For a moment, he looked surprised, then a slow, deep smile spread across his face. They did not speak, but the silence between them felt warm and full of promise. By the time the snow finally began to melt and the first birds returned to the trees, Annie and Chaska had quietly become something more than companions. Their bond had grown into a tender love, not rushed, not forced, but genuine and rooted in trust. Annie no longer thought about the man who abandoned her or the life she thought she should have had. She had found something far better, something real, honest, and strong. They began to plan what came next, whether they would stay in the cabin for the rest of the winter or travel to meet his tribe, where he wished to introduce her in time. Annie felt both nervous and excited, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Because wherever she went now, she knew she had someone by her side who would never leave her, never judge her, and never let her face the storm alone again. And that knowledge, that promise, was the true beginning of her new life. Spring arrived in slow, gentle waves, melting the snow, filling the rivers, and turning the prairie a soft, pale green. With each warmer day, Annie and Chaska knew it was time to take the next step. Her strength had returned fully. She could walk easily in the beautiful beaded moccasins he had gifted her. She had grown used to the rhythm of life in the wilderness, fetching water, sharing meals, learning the stories of Chaska's people as he spoke them quietly in the evenings. But now she was ready to meet the larger world of his life, his family, his tribe. One morning before the sun rose, Chaska saddled his horse and prepared a small pack of supplies. Annie helped him, her hands steady. She wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt something new, anticipation, a fluttering hope in her chest. Chaska looked at her, slightly concerned. "Are you sure? It is a long ride. And my people are kind, but strangers may surprise you." Annie placed her hand on his arm. "I want to meet them. I want to know your world," she said softly. "You gave me a home when I had none. Now I want to see the rest of that home." Chaska smiled, the kind of smile that started in his eyes. He helped her onto the horse, then mounted behind her, and together they began their journey toward his tribe's spring encampment. The ride took several hours through rolling hills and flowering meadows. Birds sang overhead. Annie leaned back, gently against Chaska, feeling safe and at peace. When they finally approached the Lakota village, a circle of tipis arranged neatly in a clearing, Annie's breath caught. It was beautiful. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires, children played nearby, and the elders sat weaving or carving. Life moved like a quiet current of harmony. As they rode closer, several people looked up, curious. Some recognized Chaska immediately and greeted him warmly. When they saw Annie, they were surprised but not hostile. Chaska dismounted first, then helped her down. He introduced her to the elders with dignity and calm pride, explaining how he found her in the storm and how she had shown courage and kind heart since to her surprise. The Lakota elders listened, with open expressions. An older woman stepped forward and gently touched Annie's cheek as if welcoming her. Another elder gave Chaska a knowing smile, the kind people give when they see something good beginning. Over the next 2 days, Annie stayed among them as a guest. Chaska's relatives offered her food, showed her how they cooked, sang songs in the evening, and even let her help with small tasks. No one judged her or asked about her past. They only cared that she was kind, respectful, and important to Chaska. Slowly, Annie realized something extraordinary. She felt accepted. Truly accepted for who she was right now. It was as if the pain and shame of her previous life were melting away in the warmth of a community that saw her with open eyes and hearts. One evening, as the sky turned a gentle purple at dusk, Chaska brought her to a quiet spot near a small stream that ran past the village. The water glimmered with the colors of the sunset. He took her hands, looking into her eyes with a steady, gentle gaze. "You have walked through sorrow, through snow and shame," he said quietly, "but you have come through it strong. I cannot promise a life without hardship, but I promise to walk beside you through it as long as you wish me to." Annie's heart swelled. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "There's nothing I want more than to walk beside you," she whispered. He smiled, not the small smile of politeness, but a deeper, glad smile from his soul. He pulled from his pocket a braided leather wristband, something his mother had once made, a symbol of union and partnership. He tied it gently around her wrist. She touched it as if it were more precious than gold. In that moment, under the fading sky and beside the soft murmuring stream, she knew she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not just safety, but belonging, dignity, hope, and love. The next morning, word spread through the camp that Chaska and Annie planned to be together. Some sang a blessing, others gave her small gifts, beads, a piece of cloth, a carved pendant. Annie felt overwhelmed by the kindness. She looked at Chaska and realized she was home. She had left her old life behind, the letters from a man who rejected her, the shame of a past she never deserved, the loneliness of a world that refused to see her worth. Now, surrounded by the Lakota people and the man who saved her, she stepped into a new identity, not as an abandoned bride, but as a woman finally free, cherished, and deeply loved.